Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining. Please just give us a couple more minutes while we wait for a few more people, and then we'll start. Thank you for your patience. And in the meantime, hosts, if you can turn on your videos, thank you.
You're muted, Kate.
Thank you, Manana. Rookie mistake. Thank you to everyone who joined us this morning. We know it's been really short notice and there's a lot going on, so we appreciate you making the time. So as many of you will know, 8 months ago in October, South Africa and India made a proposal before the World Trade Organization to temporarily waive intellectual property on life-saving COVID-19 medical tools. Then on Wednesday night, South Africa time, the United States came out and said that they would be supporting the waiver as well, which was obviously a big deal. And that's why we're here today to discuss it. So I'm going to be introducing my panel who will be making opening comments, and then we'll open up the floor to questions. So first of all, we have Fatima Hassan, the Director of the Health Justice Initiatives. Then we have Yuan Kiong Hu, who's the Policy Coordinator with the MSF Access Campaign. And finally, we have Umanyana Rujeje, who is the Executive Director of Section 27. So all of them are lawyers, and I'm very pleased that we have an all-woman panel. My name is Kate Stegeman. I'm the Advocacy Coordinator for the MSF Access Campaign here in Southern Africa. Okay, so I think to kick us off, Fatima, if you could just start with some opening remarks, please.
Thank you, Kate, and thank you everybody for joining this webinar. So I just wanted to make a few points before handing over to Yuan and to Umanyana. The first is that we're in a crisis. I mean, over 3 million people have died and infections are increasing around the world. And I think the situation in India and Nepal and Sri Lanka is obviously cause for concern. So the momentum that needs to be built in the next few weeks and months is basically the difference between life and death for many people in the global south. The second thing I wanted to say is that obviously while we welcome the Biden administration's announcement, and really he's giving effect partially to a promise he made when he was campaigning to be the president of the United States. So even though it's 8 months too late, we still do welcome it. It is a small step to be able to go forward in terms of the TRIPS waiver, but also in terms of other initiatives to scale up manufacturing, not just in Africa, but in parts of the global south, particularly in Latin America and Asia as well. And maybe this actually, the statement from the US Trade Office is actually the first of a long journey where over the next few decades, we'll finally be able to have a real reckoning around the impact of intellectual property on access to healthcare services, in particular medicines. The fact that medicines are still commodified, that they are subject to a trade regime and subject to the quite excessive and quite protectionist rules of the World Trade Organization is a key concern for many organizations and many health access advocates and activists. We've seen in the last 48 hours that once the US made its announcement that there's going to be a likely impact on whether the countries that continue to oppose the waiver, and that's the entire EU, you've got Australia, you've got Canada, you've got Switzerland, you've got Norway, you've got Japan, you've got Brazil. So a number of countries that have already started vaccinating their populations, that have over-ordered a lot of doses, that are also drawing on supplies from COVAX, which is meant to be supporting low and middle income countries, are actually ironically blocking the waiver and the ability of people in low income parts of the world to access vaccines. And you've seen the stats this week, 0.2% of vaccine supplies have actually been administered in the global south, and most of the vaccine supplies, about 80%, have already been vaccinated, have already been given to people as part of vaccination programs in the global north. The EU, there's some preliminary indications that they may be willing to have further conversations, and we do expect that there'll be a split within EU member states. And surprisingly, we've seen the German government actually come out quite strongly in favor of intellectual property and patent protections. And that may have something to do with the Pfizer-BioNTech situation, but we can discuss that in the Q&A. We're seeing some U-turns from other leading foundations as well. We just saw a statement from the Gates Foundation yesterday. So I think that we shouldn't underestimate the statement and the move by the US government. It's certainly going to create a ripple effect. What do we need now? We obviously need transparent negotiations. We've learned from past lessons, particularly around how the Doha Declaration was negotiated. We can't basically wait for months for this waiver to be finalized and for the text to be finalized. It needs to be transparent. Civil society needs to have a seat at the table. You can't defer only to pharmaceutical interests and to vested interests and to, well-funded lobbies in the negotiations. And also it can't be watered down. The statement is very narrow by the US government. It only relates to vaccines. The waiver proposal was much broader in a sense. It asked for all COVID-19 related technologies. The situation around access to testing, diagnostic kits, ventilators, oxygen, treatment, potentially even remdesivir, means that the waiver can't actually just be narrowed down to vaccines. And so that is a key concern for us. I'd like to just in closing acknowledge actually the South African government and the Indian government. I don't think we've given them enough credit in this entire saga. They've been negotiating in the beginning alone. For almost 8 months, they've had a lot of diplomatic opposition. They've had a lot of opposition from the wealthier countries that have been opposing the waiver, and they've been steadfast in making sure that the waiver is actually becomes a central issue that needs to be discussed at the WTO, and have been pushing that. And so our negotiating teams, I think, really deserve a lot of credit from civil society and from the media in South Africa. It's unfortunate that the government has not briefed us enough about it. The president took very long to actually talk about the TRIPS waiver and the implications of asking for that and the proposal being led by the South African and Indian government. But be that as it may, we now here at this particular moment in time, which I think is quite significant as a health activist in the space for over 20 years. This is something quite remarkable, the speed at which we've been able to actually get the US government to course correct. So yeah, in closing, what we now need, tech transfer, the sharing of knowledge and the sharing of the vaccine know-how, because we all know that the waiver is just one part of a bigger puzzle, which basically needs to be addressed collectively and jointly so that we can actually scale up production and manufacturing for the global south. Thank you, Kate.
Thank you, Fatima. And over and above giving credit to negotiators from South Africa and India, I think a lot of you here will agree as well that what we've seen happen in the last few days is also a huge testament to incredible advocacy efforts from civil society organizations. So, of course, from Doctors Without Borders, Section 27 Health Justice Initiative, the People's Vaccine Coalition have really pushed hard. So an incredible effort. And I think for some of you, remembering back to what we dealt with the HIV crisis, it's really fantastic to see this kind of momentum happening again for such a big public health crisis. So over to you, please, Johan. Please just to reflect a little on what some of MSF's opening statements are with regards to the news that happened on Wednesday night. And perhaps you could give us a little bit of insight as well into what we can expect to happen in the coming weeks at the WTO.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the opportunity. Also echo what Kate said. What we are hearing and seeing now in the past few days is really a result of the global effort from civil societies and South African negotiators, Indian negotiators, many institutions and advocates help. So from MSF side, it's we take this move from the US quite positively because we know historically, normally US would normally be the last country who is blocking everybody else. But then the dynamic now is very interesting to observe, especially this announcement was made very shortly after the USTR's new Special 301 report this year launched without any attack on composer license. So we thought it shows probably two things. One is activism can really push the boundary and open the space for public health safeguarding. And secondly, there's probably really some discussion going on in White House with new administration. They probably want to do something different. But as we know, it's always tricky when it's come to US politics. We still need to wait and see what would be played out in the coming weeks and months when it's come to the concrete actions. But in any case, politically, this is a really dramatic and significant moment for this movement. So when it comes to maybe two things for us for now to take note from our perspective. One is what US is saying when we read the details of the statement, and what the other, for instance, Fatima mentioned, countries started having positive reaction, but also some countries started having negative reactions, such as we know Germany, Merkel already said she's not following, and Switzerland said they are not following, but other countries more or less either already said positive message or show some willingness to open up for negotiation. But if we look at what the US statement is exactly saying, we see that as some details, devils are still in the details for us to keep observing. They only mentioned the vaccine, so they only mentioned vaccine, which is very different from what South Africa and India are proposing and agreed by 100 countries to actually cover diagnostic, therapeutics, technologies, and materials. So everything needed to ensure supply and production should be covered because we are in an emergency. So to what extent that was the choice of only talk about vaccine was a tactical one or a practical one, we still don't know yet. So we will see how US would do in the following WTO process. So whether, because sometimes we know a lot of the public media only talk about vaccine when it's talk about waiver, we always said that, it's not correct, you should talk about everything, right? But then it's a choice because vaccine is probably the most, it's a hot topic. So we don't know whether it is, again, whether it's a tactic choice for USTR to only focus on vaccine, or they have made this choice, they only support waiver on vaccine. So we still need to watch what's going to happen. And secondly is that they clearly say they are ready to engage text-based negotiation, which is also a very good sign, because we have been also asking and advocating, especially among the opposing countries, to see, okay, at least you don't stand in the way for other countries to start text-based negotiation. And then the text-based negotiation request has been increasing also in Geneva. What we heard in General Council, a lot of people also, a lot of countries also ask for text-based negotiation among these 100 supporters. But then we also know technically if a country really start text-based negotiation, it will be a new stage of the battle and fight when they really look at the language. We do have a lot of senior advocates in the movement who had to experience how, for instance, Doha negotiation was done, and how the Doha Declaration paragraph 6 was kind of compromised and then watered down in the follow-on kind of implementation, and resulted in the Article 31 bids, which was totally useless. So similar thing could happen, because pharma will not give up. If people really start negotiation, we will probably face another level of battle over there. So last bit was also one of my colleagues flagged to me this morning, actually, if we look at also how media reports about this issue, and so probably also how people talk to media about that, some of the media start saying, oh, now the country started following the US initiative on waiving the patent. And we said, okay, that's wrong. This is not US initiative, it's a developing country initiative, right? It's a South African initiative, it is an Indian initiative. 100 countries and 61 of them already officially sponsored. They already got it since last year, and it's a seven months that has been wasted because of this small group of countries who don't get it, or who choose to bond over pharma pressure other than do something different. So those kind of narrative probably will keep coming in, and you know, I don't know, from a narrative and framing perspective, we probably just need to keep reminding people it's not the US initiative. If it is a South African India initiative, it's a developing countries request. So that is, I mean, 3 very quick observation in the past 2 days we are having. And then there's also a rumor, which is not yet verified, that US is probably drafting something, but we know South Africa and India already worked on the revision text. It's just they haven't presented it. What we heard was that last week in the TRIPS Council formal session, again, there's a lot of circular discussion. I mean, and in the General Council this week, I think the last 2 days, there was no decision also, but it clearly noted by the chair reporting what's happening in TRIPS Council is that the proponent led by South Africa and India are planning to present the revision text somewhere in May, so somewhere either around or after mid of May. But for the moment, there's 2 variants. We don't know whether the sudden change of position by US would accelerate that process of presenting the revision text or not. And secondly, how much that would change the schedule of the informal meeting, because normally we know now already they will hold informal discussions, bilateral negotiations, until the TRIPS Council meet again for the formal session will be only in June, which is again quite late. So in May, it's probably very critical for us to clarify and also to understand a bit more how this dynamic now happening in the public space would impact the Geneva process. Yeah, so I will stop here, and then we.
Just before we move on to Umanyana, perhaps Yuan, if you could just give a quick description exactly on what we mean by text-based negotiations for people who aren't familiar with the WTO process, and perhaps also reflect just briefly on why they seek consensus as well in those negotiations.
Okay, thanks. So text-based negotiation. So I mean, to simply in a simplified term, for instance, South Africa have, you know, India have this piece of proposal, and now the opposing country basically don't talk about what has been written, but more talk about, you know, we have a COVAX, don't worry, IP is very important. We should work with the company. We should use a voluntary license. They don't talk about what has been written by South Africa and India, because that is the foundation of a piece of law, because we are actually proposing a legal instrument under the WTO framework. So the text-based negotiation would envisage a process that countries should stop talking about COVAX, because it's not the business of WTO. They should stop talking about how important IP is, but talk about what has been presented and say, okay, I agree with this paragraph. Maybe we need to replace this word with another word, and we can negotiate the duration, how many years, how to determine the end of pandemic, they should come to these practical terms when normally the legal process would envisage. And then once they have a draft that commented by people and the building up the agreement, and then the consensus would be deemed to be achieved. But then the one tricky part of the WTO process is that, as Kay mentioned, they work on consensus in most of the cases, meaning that everybody needs to agree, or at least nobody said no. People can abstain, but nobody should be saying no in order to have a decision. And for the waiver matter, as we know before, that could be a potentially hypothetical situation of voting, but then the vote has to be 3/4 majority, but this voting was only used once in the WTO history in the case that a consensus was already be achieved. So for this particular waiver, we still don't know from our understanding, the proponents and others, and the sponsors are not ready to test the voting system yet, meaning that this is still need to be nobody say no. This is scenario. So the negotiation, even if start, will still be a quite heavy process.
Thank you very much, Yuan, for your insights. So over to Umanyana from Section 27 for her opening comments.
Thank you so much, Kate, and thanks to Yuan and Fatima for those opening remarks. I think what I will focus on then is to talk more about the domestic legal framework, to connect that to what is happening internationally at the World Trade Organization level. So in South Africa, we have a Patents Act that governs all patents in the country. We comply with the WTO rule that we must give out 20-year monopolies to any pharmaceutical company that applies for it in South Africa. And so we have a system that actually does not take advantage of what we call the TRIPS flexibility. So what the TRIPS says is that firstly we must comply with the 20-year monopoly, but it also gives different kinds of flexibilities. For example, a compulsory license can be issued if a company is not exploiting its patent in the country. Or if there's a public health emergency, the government can actually get a government use license to ensure that we're able to access generic versions of that medicine. So we're in a position where we have a 1970s Patents Act that never changed post the Doha Declaration, which passed at the WTO in 2011. And that declaration was at the WTO level, at government level, to say, we agree that there is an impact on public health. These patents do impact on public health, and every government is entitled to do what it needs to do at its own country level to ensure access to medicines, to protect public health. So even post that big agreement, which came on the back of the big court case where all the pharmaceutical companies sued the South African government at the time of Nelson Mandela. And so the Doha Declaration actually came out of the big push to push back against Big Pharma. They were concerned about being able to access markets in Africa. And so they pushed back very hard on our government when our government tried to use these kinds of flexibilities to say, we want to be able to parallel import cheaper drugs from other countries, even where there is a patent in South Africa. So essentially what we've been arguing for since 2011, our campaign started in 2011, the Fix the Patent Laws campaign, is that we need to update those laws. And we've been negotiating with the government and the pharmaceutical industry. There have been many versions of the policy document that is now in place since 2018. But it took many, many versions, many, many meetings, many commitments that were never met. And so with the push of civil society, we actually have a 2018 policy that begins to think about how to balance public health and patent protections. That policy talks about the Constitution and says that indeed the government has an obligation in terms of Section 27 of the Constitution to put in place legislation that advances the right to healthcare services. And there's a clear recognition that the current Patent Act and the system of the patent regime is not in line with Section 27 of the Constitution. So there's a lot of work to be done. And last year, early in the pandemic, what we did was to call for a number of things. The first thing was a moratorium on any new patents on COVID-related technologies. So that's before we even had vaccines, before we knew what treatments were going to work. We said, let's make sure that we're not giving out new patents on these technologies. The second thing what we demanded was for automatic compulsory licenses, where there are health technologies that are found to be effective against COVID, but that have patents. And thirdly, we demanded the urgent finalization of the amendments to the Patents Act and related legislation. So we think that that is critically important. As much as we talk about we need vaccines and we need to have a health system that responds to the public health crisis, we also need to ensure that the legal framework, even as we talk about the waiver, we need to ensure that our legal framework is at least responsive to the Constitution, advances the right to healthcare services, and is able to do the necessary. Once there is a waiver, there's work that has to be done in every jurisdiction to implement that waiver. So there's a need for us to move forward quickly, we think. And we know, the intel that we have is that the draft amendments to the Patents Act have been done. So the work has been done, the technical work has been done, the consultations have been done at a technical level. And what is stopping the publication is basically political will. So I would encourage the journalists on the call to, in addition to talking about the TRIPS waiver, to ask questions of the Minister of Trade and Industry, why there's been a delay in the publication of the draft legislation, and when in fact it will be published for public comment. And once it's published for public comment, we always get short notice for making submissions. We can make those submissions. There are many people outside of South Africa that have been involved in the process of building out the policy, and we'll also have some international solidarity to be able to ensure that the draft laws actually also respond to public health needs. And I think in the context of the current pandemic, we need to ensure that we are prepared for the worst case scenario. And this is the worst case scenario. So this is a perfect opportunity for us to conclude that lawmaking process. I'll stop there, Kate.
Thank you, Amanyana. So if there are journalists who have questions, please can you raise your hands? And while I wait for some of you to warm up and think about what you want to ask, I'll perhaps ask the panelists one or two questions myself. So Yuan, Amanyana was referring to compulsory licenses in her discussion just now. Could you perhaps explain why existing TRIPS flexibilities and compulsory licenses in particular are complicated, and why the existing system is not necessarily going to be able to fast track, for example, if we're doing it by patent for each vaccine or each therapeutic, and what some of the challenges are, please.
Thanks, Kate, and thanks, Arena. And first, I totally agree with what Rina says on the domestic level of using this opportunity to also open space and accelerate the use of flexibility. But when it comes to compulsory license, we from our observation, exactly, I mean, before we got the waiver, right? Hopefully we got waiver. Before we got waiver, commercial license is still the most concrete and the most powerful tool, actually, if we government want to get rid of some barrier. The limitation is that for the moment, in majority of the cases, and even under the TRIPS regime, the commercial license is are mostly useful for patents. But when it's come to other IP, for instance, data exclusivity, if some country have data exclusivity or related to undisclosed information, when then commercial license is less clear in national law, when especially some country, if they introduce the data exclusivity, they sometimes don't include flexibility to say, okay, when you issue commercial license, that would automatically gone. So it's a little bit tricky in that sense, but also there's a really long time of political pressure, especially from US and EU, as we know, continuously discourage developing country whenever they use commercial license, whenever they discuss about commercial license. That is making it interesting to see the USTR Special 31 report this year and the EU enforcement report this year, both stopped mentioning commercial license as a negative practice. What we don't know is that whether this is, I mean, it shows the pressure works, but what we don't know is that whether they did this as a tactic in responding to the pressure only for this year, or they will continue stop attacking country in the future. But at the same time, they still criticize other issues on IP. So that is political pressure is one part of the reason. But practically, we already, we are saying like, actually there's two examples now showing the limitation of the only using commercial license. One is related to Canada. There's a Canadian company, as we know, the Canadian vaccine company, who didn't get a kind of voluntary license from Johnson & Johnson, who said I can produce and I can export, but Johnson & Johnson like refused me after I offered all of the terms. And then they were trying to ask for a commercial license from Canadian government, allow them to export, meaning that they have to use Article 31B, the special commercial license mechanism. But it's been 2 months now since they asked the Canadian government, and there's no decision. So, but Canada at the same time claimed in Geneva that people should just use that. It only took us 2 weeks to issue our special commercial license. So it shows that it's not so easy, because Canada, in order to use that, they need to change a lot of national legislation before they grant the commercial license to this company. A second example is we know Russia issued a commercial license on remdesivir, allowed generic production. And then recently, we also know they got sued by Gilead. Gilead didn't agree with this commercial license, they sued the Russian government. So, and India is in a very bad situation, as we know. So reportedly that the Russian government and the company trying to send some humanitarian aid supply to India, including generic medicine produced under the commercial license. But then it was delayed. If we look, we have no full data, but if we want to link this to the legal side of the issue, it could suggest two things. One, because Russia is under this lawsuit by Gilead on commercial license, they could potentially be there could potentially be complication if they use these goods in dispute for humanitarian aid. And secondly, the type of commercial license used by Russia was Article 31F, which is has to be predominantly for domestic use, meaning that if Russia doesn't want to violate TRIPS agreement, they have to justify that exportation for humanitarian aids as after predominant use in Russia. So it's quite complicated for country to quickly react and either support their industry to wrap up production or even help other countries with the existing production, because they would potentially run into different level of legal risk with the current rule of commercial license.
Thank you very much, Yuan. We're very grateful to have 3 lawyers on the panel to be able to give that kind of technical reflection, so we appreciate that. I have one quick question for you, Fatima, before we go over to the journalist questions. Perhaps you wouldn't mind reflecting a little bit on why the Biden-Harris administration has only come out in support of a more narrow focus waiver with particular reference to vaccines.
Thanks, Kate. So, I mean, just echoing what Yuan had said and what Manana had said, but, you know, our assessment of what is happening in the Biden administration is that we think there's primarily 3 reasons why they're only focusing on vaccines. The first is the public health reason, because they realize that the US is not safe epidemiologically if the rest of the world is not safe. And so you've got to vaccinate everybody quite fast, because otherwise the global economy can't resuscitate, and you'll just have multiple travel bans, and you'll just, you know, have a very difficult public health crisis. I think obviously the footage of what was happening in India made it even more difficult for the Biden administration to justify why it was continuing to block the waivers. And so that public health crisis was, you know, on national television, it was all over social media. It's very hard to escape that kind of reality. But I think the second reason is that the Biden administration, given what has happened in the US in the last 4 years under the previous administration, this is an opportunity for them to take the moral high ground. And certainly the way in which, or the shameful way in which the EU and particularly the German government have responded in the last few days indicates that Biden may be winning that particular public image battle. And I think that's sort of an important political factor in the way in which the geopolitics is operating between the EU and the US. Unless, of course, it's more cynical and it was agreed that the US would play good cop and that the EU would play bad cop, and in that way you water down the waivers. So, you know, we can't also discount that. And the third reason, I think, is because, you know, there's likely to be lots of incentives for US vaccine manufacturers through this particular waiver negotiations or through the watering down of the initial waiver proposal. And the US sees itself as a leading vaccine manufacturer. I mean, there's already pressure on the US government to invest a lot of money in, you know, creating a global vaccine hub, which would primarily create jobs for people in the US, and it would basically boost the economy. So there are also, I think, other political, economic, and public health considerations to why the vaccines are prioritized over, for example, diagnostic kits or you know, other forms of treatment. But I think the main one really is that you know, they need the world to be vaccinated so that their own population can basically be safe. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Fatima. Okay, just going over now to some questions. So from the chat, perhaps Umanyana, you can tackle this one, and the other panelists can also jump in if they want to elaborate. So from Barry, given that we already have secured vaccines as South Africa, could a waiver that only concerns vaccines have an impact on SA's rollout?
Yeah, I think, you know, we have secured vaccines. They haven't arrived, and we do know that because of the situation in India, that we may be affected in terms of the vaccines that we've secured through bilateral agreements, because India is the primary manufacturer of vaccines. So to be honest, until those vaccines land on our shores, and we know that we're getting drips of vaccines, we're getting 300,000 vaccines per week, potentially for the next few weeks. So I think that the rollout issue in South Africa is that we need to ensure that the government is working with the private sector, with civil society, with communities across the country, to be able to reach people, in rural areas and urban areas around the country. And there is a lot of goodwill in South Africa to assist. So I think that what the government needs to do, in addition to getting these deals for vaccines, is to actually work with the populace to ensure that we are quickly able to finish vaccinating healthcare workers, move on to elderly people who will need a lot of support to get vaccinated, and then the rest of the population. Thanks.
Thanks, Umanyana. Please forgive me if I'm mispronouncing your name, but Vinicius from Globo News TV in Brazil asks, do you think with Brazil, will change the position and also support the waiver on vaccine patents. Yuan, I'm going to ask you please to answer that one. I know we've recently had a bit of insight into developments in Brazil from our colleague who works there, Felipe, and perhaps you can reflect a little on that, Yuan.
Yeah, thanks a lot. We haven't heard Brazil finally change their position, but yeah, definitely they are under a lot of pressure because we heard there's a huge pressure and also demand from the parliament in Brazil, and the senators and the parliamentary are really pushing the government to change the position, because Brazil used to be a leader in safeguarding public health, and also in a situation that both suffered from the pandemic, also have a capacity to produce, because Brazil is another country who have a manufacturing capacity, and with the knowledge about how flexibility and removing IP could really benefit access to medicines. So we hope the effort from the parliamentary members, senators, and civil society could generate a positive reaction from Brazil in the Geneva process, that Brazil will come back to join the other developing countries and make sure these extraordinary moments are delivered, that Brazil itself can also contribute more in terms of diversifying the supply.
Thanks, Yuan. Yes, because for those of you who don't know, Brazil has a strong manufacturing capacity in country. And also there's been a lot of talk recently about how terrible the situation is from a COVID epidemiological point of view in India, but there hasn't been a lot of discussion about how absolutely dire the situation is in Brazil. And I think because we're getting so much information happening from India, perhaps it would be really great to see the press reporting on what's happening elsewhere and how concerning this is in so many other countries. Okay, so a question, please. Perhaps, Fatima, you could take this question from Ryan. If this IP waiver went through tomorrow, how quickly would South Africa be able to start producing vaccines? What factors, i.e. tech transfer, does that depend on? Yeah.
I mean, great question. And lots of people are asking about, well, what happens if the waiver is granted tomorrow, and where would the production capacity be? So maybe if I can just answer both those questions together, because there's a question in the chat box about mRNA production capacities. I think the first issue is, as we said in the introduction, that the waiver alone is not going to immediately translate into increased production and capacity. There has to be the explicit cooperation of the pharmaceutical industries or the people that hold the IP, or in some cases the knowledge, in order to ensure that there is a transfer of the technology and the transfer of the vaccine know-how. I think the preoccupation with whether South Africa can quickly produce vaccines or whether it's one country in Africa is not very helpful. What we do know, however, is that if you can secure the waiver, it opens the way for the negotiations and the discussions around the tech transfer. And there are companies in Africa as well as in Latin America and Asia that have untapped production capacity. It's underutilized production capacity at the moment that could benefit from tech transfer. So there's at least 6 companies that have been identified in Africa by the Africa CDC. Yes, 1 or 2 happen to be in South Africa. So there's that. The WHO mRNA technology hub idea, basically, where they've asked for expressions of interest, had at least 50 applications. So the issue in relation to the waiver, and it's why I've mentioned all of these different companies that we know potentially could actually scale up production, is that if you're not looking over your shoulder, if you are not going to be potentially sued for patent infringement or for liability or for copyright infringement, then you would be able to scale up production by having the necessary investment. And the investment can take the form of government incentives to basically incentivize you to retrofit a facility, for example, or it can be in the form of private investments into the actual manufacturing facilities. So there's definitely, we believe, as activists and organizations around the world, untapped and underutilized production capacity. And I think that, to be frank, it's the speaking points of the pharmaceutical industry to say that nobody in the global south can manufacture safe and effective vaccines, that no plants exist, that no capacity exists, that nobody can make safe and quality vaccines. If there's cooperation, the transfer of knowledge and the sharing of the vaccine know-how, it definitely is possible. And just on that, I mean, you know, the other question we get then is then, well, why don't you just accept voluntary licenses? Well, we've had a year of this pandemic. We've had a handful of voluntary licenses, and the voluntary licensees have been cherry-picked by the pharmaceutical industry. So they've decided who they want to partner with, who they want to cooperate with. And that hand-picking process doesn't necessarily also always translate into the most effective sort of quality control measures. I mean, even with aspirin, it's only a fill and finish license, it's not even a full manufacturing license. And it just reminds, you know, some of the questions that we're getting from the pharmaceutical industry in the last few days. And the speaking points of the supporters of that particular kind of approach reminds us of what happened 20 years ago when they said, well, you can't make high quality ARVs, let alone distribute ARVs in your country and in your context. And so some of the, you know, the opposition to trying to scale up production in the global south, I think, is also coming off as really paternalistic and in some cases even quite racist, I'm afraid to say. And Kate, just my last point on the compulsory licensing, because then people will say, well, why don't you just issue a compulsory license and fix the patent laws? And yes, we must fix the patent laws. And, you know, the big question is, where has Parliament been in this pandemic for the last year? The opposition parties are totally silent about the role of patents in this particular pandemic. I mean, are they doing anything meaningful to actually fast track the passage of this particular bill? If you don't pass it now in this pandemic, I'm not sure when South Africa is ever going to pass this bill. But even during apartheid and even after apartheid, in a democratic South Africa, the constitution, you know, the provisions that Umanyana has spoken about, our government has never in 100 years issued a compulsory license on a pharmaceutical product. And it's likely never to. We've said that it should, we'll demand that it will. It's likely it never will do because of the pressure and the litigation and the army of lawyers that will come down your back from the pharmaceutical industry if you actually try and do that. Thanks, Kate.
Thank you very much, Fatima. So a question from Khadija. The US government financed Pfizer and Moderna's cost of production, so between $2 and $2.5 billion, using public taxpayer monies. On the news of trial efficacy, the companies cashed in using thinly veiled but technically legal insider trading pre-application by selling stock en masse, Pfizer 60%. Is there a way to hold the companies accountable for strategically exploiting this crisis, perhaps through racketeering, collusion? The process appears to be one of draining developing countries' taxpayer budgets as financer of drugs and buyer cash cows, while developing countries are collateral damage. I'm going to open that up to any of you to see who might want to answer that one. Don't know if anyone has any strong thoughts. Any strong feelings there from anyone in the panel?
I can kick off. No, go ahead. I think all of us have some feeling, but I follow you.
I always love having Khadija on our webinars because she'll ask us the most difficult questions. But I think Khadija's right. I think it's part of the bigger story, right, in this pandemic of the conduct of pharmaceutical companies, particularly Pfizer, Johnson & Johnson. And Khadija's right. There's been significant public investment, and particularly by the US government, which I think also goes back to the earlier point of why they're focusing on vaccines, because in the case of Johnson & Johnson and Moderna, the US government is like the most significant contributor to the funding of the R&D. And in the case of Moderna, we argue that the US government even owns the IP. But I think that Khadija, you know, what is likely to happen is that those are the issues that will be considered in 2 or 3 years' time, when we've actually vaccinated as many people as possible and actually get through this initial part of the public health crisis. Sorry, Kate, can I just add one thing to the previous question? I think Barry asked about or somebody asked about the mRNA production capacity. Just, you know, I'd urge you to follow a lot of the threads and information being issued by Public Citizen and Prep for All. And a lot of significant work is being done by US groups that are putting pressure on the US government, particularly around the mRNA technologies. And that's why we've been also focusing on Moderna quite a bit, even though though South Africa hasn't even been able to secure any supplies of Moderna, and Moderna doesn't even want to come into South Africa despite pledging a little bit of dosages to COVAX, which is not sustainable, is that the experts that we are speaking to suggest that for mRNA type technologies, you can scale up production and retrofit manufacturing plants within 3 to 6 months. And that type of technology is actually easier to do and easier to replicate. But if you're given the green light and you're given the go-ahead and there's a waiver and there isn't going to be, the possibility of a patent infringement suit or trade pressure from the US government to the EU, then you would be able to invest in that kind of facilities. We know that we're not sure because it's not very transparent, and the industry and a lot of governments are not really sharing a lot of information. But we hear that after the African Manufacturing Capacity Conference that was held a few weeks ago, that there's potentially some conversation between Moderna and the government of Rwanda, and so that is also something to be looking at.
Thank you, Ewan. I think you wanted to chip in there as well.
Yeah, maybe quickly on the public funding, taxpayer money, totally agree. And for the moment, I think we're seeing like one of the biggest lessons actually for high-income countries to learn is they lost all of the opportunity to hold any leverage out of this unprecedented public funding. So for the moment, it's reinforced how the current system works, right? So if we see, Moderna vaccine was funded and supported by the NIH and other institutions. Pfizer didn't even develop this vaccine. It's a German scientist, a biotech, developed this vaccine, and a lot of others, like AstraZeneca vaccine, even has controversy, was not developed by AstraZeneca. They just acquire the IP because they have money, and then because they have money and supported by others in this case. So the system is really broken at a point when the public funding was getting lost in terms of holding company accountable. For the moment, I think there should be a lot of reflections in a maybe near future if there's a new funding to be generated. We heard that there's a new effort of asking for more funding, but then how more money would fix this chaos. I'm not quite sure, unless we need to rethink about how the public funding should be tracked and accountable, and very specific conditions should be attached to those funding. Therefore, the pharma would not make a hike for their share price in the market.
Thanks, Ewan. I just got a follow-up question related to that for you, Omanyana. There's a lot of discussion as well about public funding, but an area that's slightly less looked at is public participation in clinical trials. And it's something that this isn't just about money. So for example, in South Africa and Brazil and in various other countries, people participated in those trials. And without, particularly with regards variants, without that data, those companies would not be able to market those vaccines. And I think that that's also something that's important to consider. I just wanted to know, if you had some reflections on that, Omanyana, and also perhaps, how that issue can be used to counter, some of these arguments that this was, that the vaccine development was specifically sort of driven by the global north.
So in South Africa, we had 3 different trials, clinical trials, to trial these various vaccines. And I think it's important to say that, people put their bodies on the line for this. We didn't know what the safety was going to be. We didn't know whether this was going to work. We didn't know what side effects would be linked to these vaccines. So I think fundamentally, from an ethical point of view in clinical ethics, the people who are involved in those trials and the countries who are involved in those trials, they not only put in their own resources. So we use the WITS resources, we use the academic resources in our country to run these trials. And again, the leverage that we had at the time was not exercised to ensure that access would follow from that clinical trial. And ordinarily, that's what happens. So, you know, when we do HIV trials and TB trials, we get access to those health technologies. And it seems that the pharmaceutical companies in this case really were not interested in engaging in that kind of ethical clinical trial. So I think that perspective is really important. And then also just to add, Kate, to the idea of this massive public investment in vaccine technology. It's more like $100 billion that's been paid by taxpayers around the world towards these vaccines. And I think what we know, you know, Fatima started out by saying we need to challenge this whole system. And, you know, we agree, this massive investment shows that, in fact, you don't need patents to stimulate innovation. One way in which to stimulate innovation is for countries to invest in that science, which in the US, that happens all the time. The National Institutes of Health actually did the early scientific work on mRNA technology. So there is a history of public investment in science, but this just turns around to handing over of that knowledge that's produced publicly with publicly funded, in publicly funded institutions, and it's just handed over to commercial interests. And those commercial interests then say, well, the only way we can innovate is to have these monopolies. So I think that we need to reflect on the need for us to move away from this very notion that patents stimulate innovation. And we have to really push now for alternatives, whether it's public investment, whether it's different kinds of royalties that can be paid. We're not saying now these companies should go broke. We're saying there's a way in which you can do this work of producing life-saving medicines without the kind of profiteering that we've seen during COVID, but also during the HIV epidemic, and generally in public health. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Manana. Just before I get to Mia's question, we have a great comment coming in from Marlies. She says, thank you, Manana. Worryingly, the AstraZeneca trial participants in South Africa haven't been told whether they were in the placebo or vaccine arm, nor have they been offered the vaccines if they were in the placebo arm. The trial started before the J&J one, and the third wave might be coming. That's very concerning. So another important ethical issue coming up there, and let's not even go into the no liability and compensation issue when we come to ethics. So a question from Mia, and this is one perhaps that both Omanyana and Fatima could reflect on. Could you recap what the outcome was when the South African government took on pharmaceutical companies about ARV production, and what the complexities were? What can we learn from that? So I think starting from you, Fatima, as you were around then, and then perhaps Omanyana, if you've got extra to add in, please.
So Kate is suggesting that I'm old.
Experienced, Fatima.
Oh, man. So thanks, Mia, for a great question. The thing is that the government did not take on the pharmaceuticals on ARV production. What happened in the first years of the Mandela presidency was an attempt to pass a law that would make it easier for the entire country and all medicines to have access to generic versions of medicines for parallel importations and compulsory licensing. And unfortunately, Mandela was succeeded by Thabo Mbeki, and that just, you know, enter an entire AIDS denialism. So it was activists and organizations and groups, and the very groups that are working on access to vaccines now around the world were working around access to ARVs at that time, that basically had to force the hand of the pharmaceutical industry. So, you know, we were talking about this in the week. The waiver is a rule-based system. It's within the rules of the WTO. During the HIV/AIDS crisis, when we had hundreds of thousands of people getting sick and dying on a daily basis, we had patent defiance. We took on Pfizer and defied their patents. And the irony of Pfizer now and BioNTech and the German government's position is sort of not lost on us. And the fact that Pfizer demanded that the South African government initially put up sovereign assets for the no-fault injury scheme and then backed down, but it still asked for full indemnification is a bittersweet thing to swallow, right? Which is why we're really concerned about the amount of influence that Pfizer exercises. So it was a combination, Mia, of patent defiance, of civil disobedience, and then, basically begging the pharmaceutical industry and our government to act in a way which would actually share the knowledge, share the know-how. It's the very same demands that we're making now to scale up manufacturing, so you don't just rely on one supplier, and so that you can bring a lot more ARVs into the country at a cheaper price so that it could become more affordable. And this is the thing, when Umanyana was talking about the amount of public investment in Yuan as well, is that even at that time, when we used our laws to basically ask the industry to disclose all of the research and development costs, to say, justify your price, justify the fact that you have a 20-year plus monopoly, because there's also evergreening, justify why you get to have exclusive control and decide who gets supplies, when they get supplies. Currently, the same situation with Johnson & Johnson, Pfizer, AstraZeneca, all of these companies, right? That the companies refuse to share their data. I mean, we only know about the $10 billion at least or more that Umanyana has spoken about in terms of public investment and co-funding on the current batch of the front-runner vaccines because of filings, because of access to information laws, because of declarations that people have to file. I mean, the industry is not very transparent and willing to share that. So instead of actually disclosing and justifying why they were charging those excessive prices, and remember, Mia, that the only way we were able to scale up production and bring in generic manufacturing competition was because civil society took on the pharmaceutical companies, and they didn't want to make that information available. They didn't want to justify why they were charging those prices. So they settled and they agreed to grant multiple voluntary licenses on terms and conditions that they chose, nevertheless, but they got some royalties out of it as well. But that was how we were able to bring in multiple generic supplies of, at least the first line batch of ARVs. There's been some work done afterwards, but I think that after the Mandela government was sued and after government was put on the trade watch list by the Clinton administration, and because of HIV/AIDS denialism, our government has been scared, has deferred to the pharmaceutical industry, which is why we don't have a proper, transparent and fair medicine pricing system. There's no price regulation even on Section 21 approvals. Do you know that? So Section 21 medicines can be authorized and approved, and there's no price regulation or transparency on that. We would have to go to the Competition Commission to try and argue that they have jurisdiction over Section 21 approved medicine. So the issues are a bit more complicated. And I think that the lessons that we've learned from HIV/AIDS, Mia, is that this industry is not interested, I think, in my view, so please don't sue me, in my view, in saving lives. It's interested in profit and it's interested in monopolies. And every time we have an epidemic and every time we have a pandemic, then we have to basically be campaigning and protesting and forcing, for people to do the right thing. Which is why we were obviously, I'm going to end now, Kate, but when South Africa decided to go with the waiver proposal, we were all in shock because this is, was unprecedented, right? That the fact that the South African government would actually try and use the WTO machinery to try and make sure that the entire global South can actually get access to supplies basically in our lifetime. And then just the last point about whether the waiver takes a few weeks or a few months, the point is we still have to keep the pressure up because the public health experts are telling us that this epidemic this pandemic is going to be with us for a while. It's not a once-off vaccination program that we're all going to have to do. We're going to need booster shots. We may have to have annual vaccination programs. So the possibility to make a lot of profit for a very long time exists, even with the sharing of the knowledge and of the know-how. And that is why you've got to invest in production capacity and ability. Thanks.
Absolutely, and we've already been seeing Pfizer and others make huge profits as we go along. Umanyana, I don't know, before we go to Johannes's question, if you had something you wanted to just add on to Mia and HIV crisis times.
Yeah, I'll just make one point, which is that indeed we've had all these fights and battles and we've won some of them and part won some of them, but we cannot keep fighting drug by drug, disease area by disease area. Every time there's a new thing, we can't be going to court, which is why the change in our law is so fundamentally important. We need to have a legal framework that responds to public health so that we're not having to do this one by one thing. It's, it really takes up the resources of civil society, which, the industry is quite happy with. To see us fighting these battles on many fronts. But what the key thing is to really get our legal framework up to scratch, make sure that it's constitutional, make sure that the government is actually meeting its constitutional obligations to protect public health. Thanks.
Thank you. Johannes, your question, please.
Thank you. Thanks. Can you hear me? I hope. Fatima, I mean, if I understand you right, then you are saying that the waiver problematic, it's more long term. I mean, perhaps you can already say, is it kind of half a year or is it a year that African countries could really start producing? And if it's really a bit longer term, then the question, of course, arises, what do we do in the meantime? And wouldn't there be, I mean, that's what Germany says and Europe says all the time, wouldn't the voluntary licensing be really a way? I mean, J&J did it with South Africa. What's the problem with the voluntary licensing? Thanks.
Kate, do you want me to answer? Okay, so the problem with the voluntary licensing at the moment is that they aren't enough. They're segmenting markets. They're restricting the geographies of where those supplies can go to. There's very little transparency. Even the WHO Director General has said that the current batch of, and it's only a handful of voluntary licenses. One are not very transparent, don't actually speak to the public health and epidemiological needs basically of the world, and are basically very self-serving for particular pharmaceutical industries. So Johnson & Johnson gets credit for giving a license to Aspen, but let's unpack that a bit just as an example. It's a fill and finish license. It's not a full manufacturing license, right? Initially, all of the supplies were only for exports to the global north. After pressure from us here in South African civil society, they agreed. They didn't disclose even the initial amount that Johnson & Johnson was meant to manufacture. It soon turned out that it was between 200 and 300 million dosages. We now know that it potentially could be 400 million. The initial agreement was that none of those dosages would even stay in South Africa. Now there's an agreement that between 20 and 30 million could actually stay in South Africa and the rest will go to the African Union, all right? So there's an issue around the Serum Institute's, for example, agreement with AstraZeneca as well. It restricted the number of markets it could go to, restricted the number of countries. It wasn't basically a license that was given to multiple manufacturers. So the question then is, why does Johnson & Johnson only give one fill and finish to Aspen? When the US put pressure on it, it gave a license to Merck. When we talked about the untapped production capacity and the untapped manufacturing capacity that the WHO is also identifying, you see, this is where these companies could be granting multiple voluntary licenses. And it links to Mia's question earlier about the HIV/AIDS situation, where government would only negotiate for Aspen to get a license as the preferred provider. And we always said that you need multiple suppliers and multiple manufacturers, because even amongst generic manufacturers, there needs to be competition. Even generic manufacturers, are interested in profit in markets. The AstraZeneca's conduct around voluntary licenses, MSF can speak to this as well, is also limited globally. It's a handful of licenses. It's certainly not enough. Johannes, we need to make billions of dosages. The current situation, even with the handful of voluntary licenses that some of these companies have given with very restricted terms, is not actually going to meet the production targets that we need and the demands that we need. And the reason, the last reason, Kate, why you need multiple manufacturers is this week and last week, we saw the implications of if you only have, if you have very tight control over who can produce the vaccine, you have a contamination problem in the US. It affects the entire supply chain of Johnson & Johnson, and that has basically delayed our Johnson & Johnson rollout. So had you had 10, 15, potentially more manufacturers doing the Johnson & Johnson batches, you would definitely be in a different situation. The impact on the supply chain and the entire production scale, if there's one plant only that is allowed to make that particular vaccine is an issue. And the Serum Institute, you know, and somebody will write up that story, is the perfect example and illustration of that. Because if they're the only ones that have the license and they have to serve 40 countries where the UK is the preferred customer and trumps those 40 countries, so supplies had to be diverted to the UK when the UK had a supply crisis on the AstraZeneca vaccine. And then you had two problems where Indian government basically imposed a partial export ban, but the US government imposed an export ban as well. So that means Serum couldn't get the raw materials, right? And so this is why you've got to basically, you know, what we said in the beginning, you've got to open the field in terms of getting as many manufacturers as possible. And yes, Johannes, you know, it would be great if they would give more multiple voluntary licenses while the negotiations take place, because the worrying thing in the US statement is she does say, the representative does say that this could take a lot of time because it's so complex. And that is the reason why civil society is saying that we're very worried that the negotiations will drag on, and we don't want what happened with the Doha Declaration to happen here, and that also that it be watered down. Thanks.
And just to chip in there as well, Johannes, you asked about what can be done in the meantime. MSF and others have also been calling that countries that have been hoarding doses and have excess doses are able to share those doses. So that is something potentially in the short term, while we're seeing such a discrepancy vaccine administering around the world, you know, that could be happening while these negotiations are ongoing. Ewan, I don't know if you had anything to add there as well about voluntary measures, and perhaps also not just looking at voluntary licenses, but the limitations of mechanisms we've seen so far, such as CTAP, and whether or not those have worked. Perhaps you could tell people a little bit about what that is and if it's been successful.
Yeah, I think Fatima has a very good summary of the limitation of voluntary license, and even I mean, CTAP is basically, as we know, the WHO initiative under the Solidarity Call for Action, and saying that, okay, in pandemic, encourage all of the companies come forward, openly share the technology or know-how, IP data in a global pool, so that it could be probably licensed out or generate. It's not totally clear yet, but the idea is to see, instead of one by one, because which is now what companies do, and they claim everything as what want to license or transfer. But as Fatima said, if we look closer, it's very, very limited. But the CTAP was trying to see, instead of doing one-to-one, why don't we have a global mechanism that's more open? The problem is that companies have, especially the multinationals, immediately rejected it. And some companies like Pfizer also consider CTAP initiative as dangerous, damaging. Although if we say, okay, as a kind of second optimal option before we get a waiver, which will empower a different narrative, compulsory voluntary license can be used differently. If CTAP was used and supported to meet its objective, it could be something, you know, helpful. But the problem is that nobody came forward to see, I'm going to openly share this through WHO, which will probably bring a little bit more trust and transparency. Other than for the moment, civil society globally was trying to get what exactly going on with very limited outcome, because company kept everything as confidential, and then they claim they are doing a lot, but if we closely look, it's not totally not sufficient at all.
Thank you, Yuan. I think quite a few people, Nathan, have tried to take a stab already at your question of how long a successful outcome will take. Perhaps I'm just going to narrow that down just as a reminder, and then I think we should probably go into closing comments. Yuan, just to pick up what you were saying earlier as well about the process over the next couple of weeks, and just to remind everyone that this doesn't, the negotiations still need to occur, and they themselves are going to take time, and we're not even sure if we're going to have be able to go ahead with negotiations at the next meeting in early June. So perhaps just in terms of any idea and analysis of the negotiations themselves in terms of time frame, Yuan, coming from you, and then if you could please give your final comments, and then I'll go to the other two panelists.
Okay, thanks a lot, Kate. And also, I just saw a new question coming in the chat. Maybe very, very nicely linked to what we can conclude. For the moment, as we said earlier, it's still it's tricky, because what South Africa and India are asking together with many other developing countries is not only about vaccine. So we of course now vaccine is probably urgently needed, but we see shortage of diagnostic testing, shortage of, there's basically not enough effective treatment. Even some of the treatment with limited efficacy are in shortage of supply. So it's the original proposal from South Africa and India was very visionary and very inclusive. So from our perspective, we hope that should be kept, and then maybe civil society, we can discuss with others. I mean, from MSF perspective, we would continue try to ask for the full waiver as originally proposed as a scope, because otherwise it doesn't make sense. Especially, it makes sense, but it doesn't make the full sense, especially when we see for vaccines, you need a little bit longer time and other steps to support, depend on the technology and so on. But for therapeutics and for diagnostics, there probably will be much quicker impact if the waiver was adapted. And then it's also not just about the product itself, it's also about raw materials, it's about associated technology, it's about the use, because the pharmaceutical company apply for patent and claim IP on every single step. So all of this need to be lifted in order to free the capacity globally. So that is what we were hoping for in the coming stage of the push and also the negotiation. And what's need to be done, and also what's next step, was really we're still in the stage of gathering intel, because up to the early this week, what we heard was proponents led by South Africa and India were prepared to present the revision text around or after mid-May, so for further discussion. But for the moment, we don't know whether that schedule would be accelerated with the statement. So that is from the proponent side, but from the opposing country side, we still need other countries such as now Germany and Switzerland clearly said they are not going to follow, but they hold power. They also need to come to the negotiation table to say, okay, now we have to look at the text, stop talking about ideology, looking at the text and find a solution. So that still need to happen. In order to reach that, as Fatima and Umayana mentioned, the pressure has to be kept from civil society part, because it's not over. It is a new stage of the new fight. So hopefully we know the civil society network in Europe and the US are meeting, I think today and in coming few days, to update the strategy, because still European countries would have to come on board. Yeah.
And just to echo what Joanna said, we saw a huge civil society push in the United States. It would be good to see that in other countries. So a number of organizations, former political leaders, etc., were writing letters to the Biden administration. So it would be really great to see that happen in other countries that are opposing the waiver. Closing comments, please, from you, Umayana.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks for the great questions and discussion. I would say that the US coming out with this statement in support of the waiver is massive. And it will show a trickle-down effect on other countries. We saw New Zealand come out almost immediately in support of the waiver, and France also came out to support the waiver. And the world is looking to the US and to the European Union for leadership on this. This is coming initially from developing countries. And so I think there's a bit of a colonial mentality in terms of going ahead to support developing countries and their needs. So I think that the coverage that the South African media needs to focus on is the global nature of this campaign, the fact that there's a need for a constant debunking of the pharmaceutical industry's talking points. We've heard many of them on this call. And there is, the talking points that they have are the same old ones that we heard during the AIDS epidemic. It's like there's no capacity. One of the CEOs of Big Pharma said, "Oh, I don't have engineers to send, to do tech transfer." I mean, really, let's get real and let's get serious about all of the different mechanisms that can be supported. And getting more people on board to understand the complexities. We understand that these are complex issues, but fundamentally, this is about saving lives and saving our livelihoods as well, because economies across Africa and across the world have been devastated. We've seen, increases in child hunger during the lockdown, and that really has to be able to turn around, and we can only do that once we have mass vaccination programs around the world. Thanks.
Thanks, Omanyana. Fatima, some last words?
So 3 last reflections. The one is, more than a year into this pandemic, we still don't know what our opposition parties think about medicines, patents, and intellectual property. And I think we need to probe them a bit more, because they are the elected opposition. They're sitting in parliament, and they potentially could have a significant role on passing the patent amendment bill. I think it's just disingenuous to talk about, well, we shouldn't have another lockdown, we should open up the economy, government is not securing enough supplies of vaccines, without addressing the role of the pharmaceutical industry in our own politics in South Africa. So do they fund these parties? What's going on? Why are they so silent about them? To me, is quite remarkable. The second is that we're going to have to, as civil society and the media, really follow the negotiations and keep the pressure up on the South African and Indian governments, because we are worried that in order to have a negotiated tax, that they will water it down so much that they will agree to whatever the US and the EU wants and only limit the waiver to the vaccines and come up with a very narrow waiver resolution. So we are really calling on the South African and Indian governments to continue doing what you did from October 2020. Don't relent, don't give up, and don't give in, because this is important not just for South Africa, but for the entire global South. And the third thing is we call on all the pharmaceutical companies to unblind the clinical trials. If we are good enough to contribute to scientific knowledge in South Africa, and we participated in 5 trials, 2 of which we are actually going to be using as part of our vaccine rollout. At least 4 of them have emergency use authorizations in other parts of the world, being administered in other parts of the world, in richer parts of the world. At least, the least you could do is unblind the clinical trial so that all of the participants know whether they got a placebo or not, and make sure that you guarantee post-trial clinical access. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fatima, and thank you to all the panelists today for sharing your insights. I'd also like to say a big thank you to Doctors Without Borders, MSF's comms team, who really rallied at the last minute after we got this announcement late on Wednesday night. And to all of you who came here today, the fact that we had over 40 journalists participating when you were only told about this yesterday afternoon, we really appreciate you arriving. And just to let everyone know as well, just to have a look at the chat box for anyone who has follow-up questions. Angela's details are there for you to contact. We'll also be sharing a recording of this webinar. And we really just encourage all of you as members of the media, please to carry on covering this issue. I know that TRIPS is something that's quite technical, but it's definitely something that more and more people are beginning to understand, and the patents issue generally, not just internationally. As Umanyana's brought up, it's really important that we have pressure, and Fatima's alluded to, on what's happening with the bill here in South Africa. So please carry on doing the fantastic work that you've been doing on that. We all know in South Africa that we could not do without our press. The advocacy role that they play, the transparency role, and most of the issues that we have with regards to accountability are really a question of the hard work done by civil society and the fourth estate with the press, and less to do with the role of our opposition MPs. So thank you very much, everyone, for participating, and we hope you have a great end of your week. Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Cheers.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks, MSF. Bye.
Thank you, Fatima.
Are we staying on to?
We can stay on for a quick few minutes if you have time, Johan. I don't know if we've lost Umanyana already.
Marlies can stay on, and Bori.
Kate, you're on mute.
Again, I'm just going to try and get Umanyana back.
Sure.
So I think there's just SABC, Khadija, and Sue. Need to wait for them.
Okay, Umanyana's coming back now. I'm already getting messages. Oh, sorry, Barry, I interrupted you there.
Yeah, so just to mention that, so this is still recording. So if you want to share the recording,
Okay.
you know, maybe what we can do is
Yeah, stop the.
Yeah, exactly. So exit and then return in a minute or so.
Oh, we should exit and come back. It's not possible just to stop the recording.
I'm not sure whether you can do it on your side because you're logged in as an admin.
I think
maybe try that.
I think, yeah.
There's still there's still SABC on here, and I'm not sure if Sue is from the media or.
Maybe with her administrative powers, Kate can.
I'm trying now to say goodbye.
Okay.
Or we can or we can rejoin.
Yeah, but they might still be there. I'm just not quite sure how to. Just give me a second.